I'm going to read from my book, Ways to Be Equally Human. I'm going to read the first section, which is about me being non-binary. For me, writing is an adventure. So I type something on screen, look at it, then change or delete by feel. The aim is for something immediate, but also tested repeatedly, then chopped and changed in order to achieve closure. It's not about ordering material, but reflecting experience as it is. At the same time, I'm listening for the hard to reach phrase that bends the rules, though only so far. Words have their own way of putting things, something the writer learns to work with, moving between the original phrase and the standard filler. It's a shifty business, stepping back, balancing, testing the ground, then taking my chances. These lyrical essays are objet trouvé, placed in a gallery as testers. They're the edits or selections rather than copies of life. Written by feel, they reshape the actual to serve the imaginary. In the room where I write, there's a large cupboard. From the outside, it's a tall, functional box with white panels and brown drawers. Standing higher than my head, it feels like a room within a room. I call it my depository. Knowing as I do what's inside, I'm aware of it as an archive. It's my hold all for pay slips, bills, allowances, statements, all of them going back years, plus several loose leaf folders containing paperwork itemizing everything I own. It makes me think of inventories, last testaments, and remainder books. The smaller drawers are full of printouts of stories and poems, stapled together and arranged by theme, interleaved with worksheets and lesson plans. There's what I have to show for years of teaching, and later, as a manager, covering for absent staff. If I could drill down through the layers, I'd come to a place where I was busy 12 hours a day, eating as I worked and taking phone messages as I unlocked doors and settled down classes. I was in permanent action mode, and the collection of papers symbolizes my hyped up life then and now. They were my fuel. The larger drawers resemble a mail sack. At first sight, the papers are piled up like fallen leaves. They're ink-stained and all higgledy-piggledy, but a closer look shows a pattern emerging. They're bits from a flow chart, a makeshift one with its own connections. The links are there, but easy to miss. It's a jigsaw and an album, and it backs up my life. What follows is selective. It's one way of fitting those patterns together. Rebel, rebel. 1. Let's talk about public toilets, starting with motorway rest stops. Why them? Because they're busy and divided by gender. And let's remember, as I walk into the men's, I'm wearing a dress. Of course, I feel in danger. Men take you on. I've been told several times, you're in the wrong place, love. I remember a man insisting, even though I was shaking my head, that I should use the other door. And when a friend went in with me, he told me afterwards about the filthy looks that came my way. I avoid men's eyes. I don't want to give any pumped up male the excuse he's looking for, especially as people can see I'm tall and straight bodied with big hands and a large face. And although my grey hair has volume, My voice is male, and I don't wear makeup. Being non-binary, I take it for granted that my gender is mixed, but I use the men's because I'm anatomically male. I'm no danger to anybody, but whichever toilet I choose, I could be in trouble. When I go into the men's, I head for a cubicle. It's telling myself I'm not to rush, but my pulse is up and my hands are tingling. I keep my head high and imagine facing off aggressors, but really, I want it over with as fast as possible. I was bullied at school, so my main defense is spotting body language and preparing to run, or locking myself in a cubicle. In my mind's eye, I can see blood on the tiles. I remember being inside a cubicle in a Welsh toilet. The area was full of flushing noises, piped music, and whirring hand dryers. I'd finished on the toilet and was watching the space beneath the door, hoping I could escape during a quiet period. But there was no let up, and in the end, I simply had to walk out. As I took my place at the wash basins, I realized I was surrounded by football supporters. They were quietly pumped up and ready for action. Fortunately, their random footy talk kept them busy, so I quickly splashed my hands, shaking them dry as I left. Emerging was like walking free from a juvenile detention center. Toilets vary. I've been in them alone, and a man enters, sees me, and walks straight out. When he comes back, I tell him it's the right place. The look I get is usually a combination of puzzlement, surprise, and relief. In other toilets, all cubicles except one are out of action, and I have to queue up, wondering if somebody's going to take a swing at me. And in some toilets, the layout forces me to stand shoulder to shoulder at washstands or hand dryers, bringing back memories of being knocked to the floor in the school changing rooms. When I first came out in women's clothes, I avoided all public toilets. If I was going on a journey, I'd either drink nothing, risking dehydration, or hold on until I was desperate, increasing the pressure when I went. Now, only that doesn't just generate anxiety, but became stressful as age weakened my physical control. So now I drink a little and risk having to go. I've not been assaulted yet, and probably won't see it coming if it happens. In any case, most men mind their own business. But of course, it's absurd that of all places, at the age of 75, I'm not safe in a toilet. From the very start, my secret habit put me at risk. There was no knowing what might happen if I was caught. It also implied some sort of guilt. So for much of the time, I wasn't really there. It was as if I was a spy behind enemy lines. Every so often, I've been taken over by my other self, beginning in childhood, where I sneaked my mother's underwear into my bedroom. Wearing tights in bed was softly electric. It was hot and cold all over and exciting. I felt enchantingly girly and looked after. I could hear the words of living doll running through my head. I was fascinated by nice girls in swimsuits. I'd collected their pictures cut from newspapers and hid them in my bedroom. Their faces were softly rounded and beautiful. They seemed so assured. I had a feeling from their smiles that they enjoyed being looked at. I was their secret admirer who lived in hope but expected nothing. And I watched and I waited, dreaming of the time when their smiles would meet mine. I found my ideal. All things bright and beautiful. Moving with care among his concealments, he trawled to the bottom beneath pure white cotton and folded linens to draw out his pictures of carnival winners and unaware beauties displaying on the beach. Struck breathless by their gaze, he wondered if they knew. What would they say if, like Pygmalion, they could step from the pedestal and, smiling encouragement, lead him quietly to somewhere out of sight? Would they offer all, finger guide, capture, and simple explanation, the light in the window and envelope unsealed? Or were they embarrassed, like parents caught kissing, to have him looking in? And did they, as angels, do this with intention to flesh themselves out, or simply because they could? See them now in life, smiling and composed, all day with him, their gaze, their reach, and passions blown large, put there to test him. Great ape in cotton, for bits tucked under, and goodness that awaits, and things he'd never touch, folded to his heart between pure white linen in an unmarked drawer. Decades later, when I began to dress in front of family, the limit was the front door. Even then, if my children's friends came round, I wore trousers. I avoided windows and quick change before answering callers. My real life was under wraps. I needed the house as refuge. When I started going out at night, one of my first visits was to an Islington pub on a TV night. In those days, terms such as TV and passing were coded signals, but I didn't use them. I wasn't going to be labelled and disliked secrecy, although I parked nearby so I could sneak into the pub unseen. Following instructions, I climbed a narrow flight of stairs with a voice in my head telling me to turn back. And when I found my group, I felt like an intruder. The room was full of girly girls. They were squeezed into tight skirts and heels and went by flowery female names, while I was wearing a long kaftan-style robe with low-heeled shoes. When asked, I introduced myself as Les. Looking back, I realized that was my male marker. It distanced me from being ultra femme and placed me outside the group. Later, when someone advised me to go the full way, I distanced further. I didn't want surgery or hormones and felt like an isolate. In truth, I had too many red lines. I'd not come for the chit-chat or to exchange tips on nail varnish, and I didn't want to be drawn into something clandestine. So when one young, heavily made-up TV brought me a drink and started propositioning me, I left. When I took these trips out, I felt alive. At the same time, like an actor, I was hiding behind my part. For instance, at a self-catering holiday home where I walked the lanes at night wearing a long white dress with a hood. When cars came towards me, I shrank back inside the hood and held my breath. I'd cloaked myself in strangeness and mystery like a ghost. Fortunately, nobody stopped to ask if I wanted a lift. If they had, I'd been struck dumb like Harpo. For years, I planned my outings as a POW escapes. I'd scouted the route beforehand, then on the night I'd go without glasses, carrying my other self in a bag. Sometimes, as extra insurance, I'd underdress, male outwards, female underneath, using back car seats or toilet cubicles as my changing rooms. Wherever I was, I'd an escape route ready, a backdoor exit, or at least an excuse involving appearing on stage or raising money for a charity. I knew there were stories of men like me jumping from windows or locking themselves in cupboards to avoid being found out. I'd seen female impersonators and gay male activists dress to provoke, and I'd listened to Lola and read about glam types and dowdy transvestites who copied their mothers, but the way they all presented wasn't for me. Looking back now, I see they were presented in my mind and by society as departures from the norm. The idea that I was different was tinged with denial. So how did it change? I began to tell people, and for a long time, that was enough. I dressed at home and sneaked out at night undercover, went to plays like M. Butterfly, dressed as a man, and played both sides of the gender game. I was, and I wasn't. Everything about me was reversible. I couldn't be measured or pinned down, and I lived in a world of mirrors where nothing was as it seemed. And when telling people wasn't enough, I began to write. At first for myself in hermetic poems, then in prose with Jungian references, developing into third-person narratives about epicene adolescence and the woman within. I read as well, discovering two-spirit cultures, third sex stories, kathois and hijras. It helped, but as long as I kept it private, the words were sketchy and unfinished. And although they told my story, the person they referred to wasn't really me. If I was in the picture, it had been turned to the wall. So why did it take 50 years for me to come out? The answer is what comedians call point of view. For a long time, my fallback position was simple. I lived in the binary world. I saw myself as male. Inside, I was different, but that wasn't me. The man I was in public didn't feel gendered. He had his CV, teacher, manager, father, and behind that, his politics and poetry. As doer and fixer, he was who he was. At the same time, there were other selves. For example, the cross-dresser who I treated as a split-off personality, and the showgirl in the mirror who I thought I'd grown out of. Calling yourself male makes things simple. It's the default setting. Like white or straight, it's not mentioned, and that makes it invisible. So as a manager, I didn't stop to think, just got on with it. I was my own self-styled hero who took on impossible odds and could work non-stop for hours. There's something unwieldy about being a man's man. The standard image is Ken, the Barbie playmate. Ken is stiff and muscly, but behind the mask, He's a fantasy creature. I was the same. Right from the start, my boy fitness was connected to magical thinking, where I'd fly over walls and stilt walk between buildings. In the physical world, of course, boys were required to run and jump and shout and kick balls in people's faces. So I struggled to cut a figure, couldn't pull it off, and found myself in impossible dreams. In my mind's eye, I'm still there, with Plastic Man and X-Woman. My adventures include surprise transformations, invisibility, and strange connections. I could appear on screen taking giant strides into battle. As the crazy ghost, I exited the back of the camera in a rage, chewing up my enemies. As Carly, I decapitated them and hung them upside down from the moon. Sometimes I ask myself if I put on women's clothes to hide the macho underneath. Am I a wolf in sheep's clothing or just a man in a dress? The road less traveled. The snowballs hurt, scooped from walls and rolled like dough. They had V2 powers to home in on their target. The boys called them ammo. Each hit was a small step, a call inside and walk to the block, while outside he was Oates, leaving the tent to head towards God, turning into history. I'm looking at myself in the mirror, asking myself, who's that? It's a snap reaction, but it comes from a deeper place. As I look, I sense how some people must feel when they first meet me. Doubtful, perhaps, but curious, wanting to ask questions, though unsure where to begin, or shocked, maybe, and a little threatened. For some, it's so unexpected they need a second take. For others, it's a deliberate provocation. Of course, they say to themselves, it's absurd. A man in a dress? A tall man at that, in floral leggings, with no hips or breasts, and no attempt at makeup, or any kind of depilation. Looked at that way, I'm on my own, keeping up appearances. But behind the mask, I'm divided. There's a persistent inner voice that claims I'm kidding myself, or worse, accuses me of fraud. And to prove the point, I hear myself calling blokes mate, or joshing, or punching out words like they do. It's a knee-jerk thing. I do it to connect, but at the same time, it feels quite natural. So while half of me is watching and listening, my other half is in performance mode. I'm one of the boys. Afterwards, I question who I am. Where am I on the spectrum, I wonder? And is gender forever fixed? Or is it performative? Certainly there's a scripted feel about it. Something so practiced it becomes second nature. And once it's automatic, we don't have to ask questions. The world is, and always has been, either or. It's as simple as that. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. The opposite is less defined, more open-ended, a quiet blending of me with the other. It's how I find myself in present tense, both floaty and real. And as I walk down the street, there's nothing hidden or to be afraid of. I'm fully alive. Sometimes I feel the binary is a trick to keep us permanently pumped up and preoccupied. being sexy raises the bar. It's glam and intoxicating and attention-getting, and it seems to offer a kind of magic shield. But like all drugs, when its power wears off, the only answer is to up the ante, and the more extreme it gets, the less it satisfies. In the end, it becomes a yawn. I return to my mirror image. I'm a child again, wishing I was beautiful. I'm smiling. I want people to love me. There's a doubt at the heart of being genderqueer. It's part of what we all experience, but the questions go deeper. There's a kind of urgency about it, so I can't be ignored. I recognize this when I went to a meeting with other non-binary people. Everyone had their own preferred ID, often multiple, mixing trans with queer or non-binary, plus a range of pronouns, he, she, they, or simply a first name. But what I also realized was that everyone had their own inner demon. Like me, asking those questions. It's that part of us that won't lie down. I call it my mirror man. Lots of men, in fact, ganging up and speaking out of turn, casting shade on who we really are. The task is to re-educate them. Bildungsroman. It happened in the middle of a sentence with a tap on the shoulder and a voice from the past saying, "Come with me." It was my story told by the quiet stranger who walks beside us on the road to judgment. The history of queer, from dives in the playground to midnight parades in stolen clothes and makeup. It continued as a passion concealed behind a lip curl and a look, then a quick step away to prepare my answers. I didn't say much. In the book I was writing, there were no leads or giveaways. Behind the words were the acts of transgression and self as other, where the story stopped. It wasn't like that, or it didn't really happen. I'd read about the man caught in heels who jumped to his death, the boy in a bra wired up for shocks, the husband whose family had him committed, and the deep-voiced woman forced against a wall. Like them, I had no one, unless my MX companion, whose name I'd missed, was me. As the blows rained down, I closed my eyes and pictured myself as the one that got away. I marveled too at the bar top dancers, the epicene boys in mascara and frocks, the short-haired, muscly women in black leather jackets, and the sweet-faced girls who changed at dawn into warriors. They were in love with the gods. Made like them, I followed the whole story with the voice of my guide in my ear. "Remember," MX said, pointing to the squat figurines with phallus and breasts, and the two-spirit earth protector poets speaking their truth to the tribe. And I heard, and I grew, and lived my life in a shape-changed, happily ever after story, and didn't come of age. I recently read Two-Spirit People, a collection of essays about Native American gender, identity, sexuality, and spirituality. My aim was to investigate how other societies have viewed people like me. It was a dryly academic collection of essays, but well researched, featuring several papers written by Indigenous people. The book described the diverse, multi-gendered patterns accepted amongst the Northern American tribes who base their society on a different idea of what it is to be human. Two-Spirit People begins by exploding the label Badash, a term used by Western anthropologists for so-called passive homosexuals who wore women's clothes. In fact, their clothes, though differentiated, were less binary than in the West, and their roles more varied. Personal identity in North America sprang from what you did, plus your spirit life, not from biology. It was common for women to take hunting roles because of gender imbalance in tribes, and two-spirit people were sometimes regarded as doctors, poets, mystics. That changed during the 20th century under the influence of Western thinking. So gender bending was seen as tainted by many indigenous groups and its existence denied in interviews. But before that, there were records of people switching gender and developing intermediate genders with a male to female bias that may reflect the researcher's point of view, or a society that takes more note of men than women. Also, there were same-sex pairings that were regarded as heterosexual. The key was usually a person's spirit identity. If two men or two women were together, but one had an opposite gendered soul, then they were regarded as straight. Having said that, the different tribes' cross-gender and multi-gender behavior, which so shocked the missionaries, took many different forms. The label Two-Spirit was adopted as closer to the Native American model rather than a Western LGBTQ+ perspective. In several personal stories, North American indigenous people described a wish to reconnect with their tribal roots, having gone through a gay liberation phase. So, what did I take away from the book? Firstly, I realized that the term two-spirit has to be understood in context. It's wrong to appropriate it, but it does suggest that cross-gender behavior was okay in the past. Secondly, the book hints that even before colonial thinking set in, there were times two-spirit people faced discrimination from their peers, while, paradoxically, being treated as mouthpieces for the gods. It's an ambivalence that drives contemporary fears of gender fluidity. Thirdly, these stories are a reminder that our Western, materialistic, and reductive idea of humanness are a narrowing of life. What are you, man or woman? It was Friday lunchtime, and I was with the group outside Barclays speaking to people about fossil fuels. We'd been inside, acted a die-in, filled the pavement with bodies and placards and been taped off by the police. It looked like a crime scene. Now we were preparing for part 2 of our protest. The question, or statement, came from a young, overweight spectator man standing at the front of the crowd. He was staring at me with a dirty grin. I could picture him ogling girls and winding up kids at school. Behind me, two demonstrators, one male, one female, were kneeling in front of a large black and white sign. They were getting ready. My answer popped out without thinking. Neither. Part of me had always considered myself male, softened by the non-binary label, but to be neither took it further. I'd become myself, a resistor picked out by my difference. I could hear in my mind the words of "Where the streets have no name." It had happened before. I'd been called a lady, sarcastically, aimed from behind, whistled and shouted at, and once curb crawled while shopping. Being catcalled was no surprise, and the man in the van was a Bluto type, but it took some getting used to. It was a lesson in what women had to put up with. "What the fuck?" my spectator man said. In my head, I completed his phrase with, "Are you?" A thin woman in a red top stepped up to the kneeling demonstrators. She was holding a bottle of thick, dark liquid. "Climate breakdown," I called. "This bank funds it." I stared at the man. With his bristly chin and leering expression, he was acting a part. I could see him in later life, leaning on a bar and swearing at women on TV. "Crazy," he said, screwing one finger into his temple. Behind me, the woman had raised her bottle to head height. As the spectator man glared, my thoughts flashed back to a bully at school. It was all about swagger and overstated gesture. There was nothing underneath. "F Bank," the woman called, anointing the protester's head. As the liquid oozed across flesh, the spectator man laughed. "Weird," he shouted, waving one arm. "Weirdo man, weirdo people." Choosing his moment, he began to walk away. "No, beautiful," I said, as the liquid spread like gravy. "But also not beautiful," I called as it hardened to a crust. "Neither really," I added, "just human and wanting to live." In my mind, I heard the phrase, "That's why I'm here." His question had been answered. Sue, my wife, calls me her beautiful boy. When she says that, I feel warm and cared for. It takes me back to the words of "With a Song in My Heart." I'm the child at the front of family photos. I've ice cream in my hand and I'm smiling. The softness of my features makes some adults ask me if I'm a girl. Although I answer no, secretly, it makes me happy to be asked. I like the idea of being in between. I know it's unusual, I know, but I'm telling myself a story where I go to the ball in a gown and slippers. When I switch to playing the handsome prince, I'm actually a girl acting the part. In the books I'm reading, I'm a tomboy riding a bike and climbing trees, and when I get home, I put on a dress. At school, I sit with the girls and learn cat's cradle. Dressed as a girl, nobody can see me or touch me or call out nasty names. Later, in my teens, I'm reading Tolstoy's childhood, boyhood, youth, collected in one volume. I've chosen it because I'm trying to understand how boys become men. I try to go about my own business, act adult, and not show weakness. I'm learning how to give nothing away. Even then, secretly, I want to be admired. There are words I'd like to use, such as beautiful and lovely. In my mind, I can hear Maria singing, I feel pretty. She's looking in the mirror and seeing me. For a long time, my beautiful boy stayed in hiding. I kept myself busy making things happen. The aim was to impress. If I could stay calm and solid and remain on top while doing the business, then I'd be safe and nobody could touch me. That way, I'd be a man and my real self wouldn't show. But for anyone looking closely, I wasn't what I seemed. Like Gulliver, I'd 1,000 tiny threads tying me down. My heart wasn't in it. I come back to how it started. I see myself as the high-voiced child singing to family, switching to a girl in secret, pouting. Now I'm the boy with wings reading Ode to a Nightingale. And now I'm the pre-pubescent girl with smooth skin and false breasts. I'm tingling all over as I walk out at night in a dress. Later, I'm the man who switches gender in the middle of Chopin, who understudies Bowie and smiles, listening to Rebel, Rebel. It's about changes, switches, renewals, transformations, because I'm still Sue's beautiful boy. Do angels have gender? The angle of his arm and thrown out hand is a bird of paradise flower where the sunbirds land. She's in orange and black, in a blue-green softness of love burning down, the hotness and ache of blanched skin are he, she, they, seen through a glass, darkly. If this is the way of all flesh, root and flower of none named self, then with what wings do angels dance their death?